Army 6 Army Intern Program Section 1 Overview and Interview of the Army Intern with a significantly able to retrieve the capabilities based on civilian workforce that's critical to the strategic human career planning. Army Intent Program replenish with the technical functional expertise of the Army Civil Corps, the development professional with the right skill to meet with the future mission, the leadership of the active of the intern program, effect with the meet with the track with the quiet with the develop, to retain with the essential pipeline with a well-trained, capable of defense civilian personnel in order to ensure the Army continue to manage activities intent in terms of the strategic reach of the implementation of effective and efficient and effective management strategy and operative. Synopsis of the Army Intern Program, 2-year full-time entry-level permanent civilian training development program available to all career program that annually allocate with the activities and initial of the position based up to forecast future Army mission requirement MITP established for each of the career program to develop the conference with the on-the-job with the formal training for the strategic reach over every of the activities in terms of the time of the mobility agreement and result of the internship of the placement over the area with the civilian right skill with the right time in the right place with the meet with the property with the needs of the Army. Security type of the Army at level of the professional development program. 3 professional development programs reference for the term of the funding file of the Army Civilian Training Educator Development System funded by the activity funding industry level of participants certainly funded by the Army to some of the activities to the table of distribution and allowance of the Army Secretary of the Army MRA activity funding program activities of the Army interim of the operational personal management with the management of the President Management Fellow of the program with the federal agency with the Army selects points have the President Management Fellow after the certificate completion of the 2-year leadership of the development program with the President Management Fellow with the competitive some of the non-competitive competitive of the promotive of the permanent position of the largest grade at G7 G12. Locally funded entry level of program participant found with the employment activities assignment of table of distribution allowance for the treatment employing activity distribution with the command of the locally funded the program included the following locally Army internal functional training, local training over the receipt of the on-job training, other training of the D necessary with the performance specific job of the functional training is not reported as an intern. Section 2 of the Army Civilian Training Education and Development System, the intern of the entire private management with the intern of the executive of the resource board, for the component of the Army Development Board with the purpose of the oversee of the prior of the forecasting activity of the internal position of the Army to ensure the appropriate use of scarce the resource alignment of the department's strategic direction consider the anticipated program mission requirement that were relevant the criteria of the factors. The Department Army Secretary of Affairs civilian personnel may invite the co-chair delegate responsible for the future of the Army and internal executive resource board of the Army internal executive of the resource board with the chair of the Department of Defense Secretary of the Army Affairs civil personnel will comply with the directive of the Civilian Human Resource Agency Command G1 SES level designated representative of the functional chief of the representative of the Army intern executive of the resource board of the right with the use activity intern allocation meet the basic strategic requirement of the Army the result of the use position functional chief of the representative command base and approve the access intern allocation of the DAS civilian personnel the recommendation activity resource allocation intern ASA amendment RA recommendation of the policy procedure the activity intern of the strategic of it set Army civilian training education development system and the recruitment style of the civilian human resource agency of the North Civilian Region, ARC with the responsible essentially with the activities in terms of the world body, some of the job and select with the exemption of the defense with the civil, the unit, person, and power with the personnel with the system, recruitment of the Defense of civilian internal intelligence personnel with the recruitment of the activity recruitment and call with the even civilian human resource of the West Region, North Central ARC civilian human resource region with the Army activity recruitment call with equivalent of the functional chief of the representative to determine the recruitment the method of development the activity the recruitment and the activity determine clear special planning placement program the review of the transcript review with the appointment eligibility issue with the referral of the activity determine the review candidate with the functional chief the review. Some of the job offer the coordinate with the intro with the duty with the class dates with the description of the other related document of the activities and determined with the Army Civilian Training Education the development system intern pro manager functional chief of the review with the development of the career program with the manager of the intern with the management functional chief of the review with the enterprise with the management oversight of the assignment the intern with the principal one with the contact with the Department of Defense Secretary of with the civilian personnel with the CCPD with the enterprise with the civilian personnel with the intern with the manager maybe the with the career program civilian personnel program and another staff of the member of the civilian program proponents the office Army Civilian Training Education Development System and determine the activity into the program GS5 with the GS7 or GSO7 the equivalence for you exemption of the activity and determine the complete with the competent with the under the job formal training requirement for trouble the MITP with the designation of the career program and the satisfaction complete for the program and the requirement confer eligibility, non-competent promoted, full performance level of the general GS09 or GS11 equivalent, and signed with a mobility agreement, a conditional employment essentially focused at headquarters department of Army activity and determined with a maximum of the 24 months with a complete MITP for the defined with a career of the program, centralized running the coverage of the salary benefits to cover the training and travel costs. Forecasting of the allocations. The Army activity and implemented forecast allocation profit at the beginning of the Army forecast. The forecast of the adjusted for the recommendation functional chief of the review of the command G1 with the allocation profit the column with the Army in intelligence and excellence review board subsequent Army secretary of the Army manpower and reserve affairs approval of the final interim allocation process. Step of the preliminary allocation department of secretary of the civilian personnel with the retrieve of the data annual civilian forecast system in term of the forecast module to facilitate interim projection command with the career program and occupational sleeve of the next fiscal year. Permanent assistant secretary of the civilian personnel prepare with the preliminary in term of the allocation project of the base and the analysis of the data with the department of assistant secretary of civil personnel for the vice function chief of the review of the downturn of the budget restriction of the potential effect of the interim and the requirement of defense of the secretary army civilian personnel concurrent provides the information command over the G7 and cover the collaborate functional chief of the representative identify with the necessary adjustment reconciliation of the functional chief of the review with the work with the functional outcome component over the command level the subsequent coordinate with adjustment of the recommendation command G1 provide with the functional chief of the review with the recommendation adjustment preliminary interim allocation and turn allocated adjustment but it will be based on the document and current with the forecasted staffing of the need with the command with its capability training with the interim and the coordinate with the command G1 functional chief review consolidated requirement of defense of the secretary of the civilian personnel revised assessment number activity internal allocation required with the civilian personnel indicate with the plane distribution command location on the projected moment of the entry final proposal of the defense of the secretary of the affairs civil personnel values revised career program and estimate of the consolidated requirement consolidated active funding department of defense secretary of affairs civilian personnel issue proposed activity in return allocation of each career program command consideration army intern executive resource board defense of the army secretary civilian personnel concurrent with the release of the proposed internal allocation of the functional chief representing the command G1 recommendation approval of the Department of Defense Secretary of the civilian personnel with the Army Intelligence Executive Review Board finalized activity interim resource allocation recommendation the Secretary of Citizens of the Army Manpower Reserve Affairs approval of the Secretary of the Army Manpower Reserve Affairs and the DSA civilian personnel with the activity interim and the allocation functional chief of the review board command with the civilian human resource Norman chief of the review Army active with the recruitment policy with the sexual with the Army Intelligence with the executive with the resource with the details executive with the relocation functional chief of the review executive with the active with the interim allocation behalf of the command with the coordinate with the command with the initiative with the recruitment and allocate with the Army act as recruitment goal with the defense with the acquisition secretary with the civilian personnel coordinator with the functional chief of the reserve assistant secretary of manpower reserve with affairs option with the activity with the interim and the authorization not timely available to other civilian personnel. And go ahead. Activity recruitment call for the responsible for the students for the activity in some of the world while the exam of the job offer the civil activity prior initiation of the activity intern activity the recruitment call coordinated with the functional chief of the functional chief of the representative of the term of the requirement that of the activity in term of the position recruitment that for the target outside with the assistant secretary manpower reserve with the functional chief of the representative with the coordinator with the command with the provide with the recruitment to fail with the scale of the campus with the outreach orders of the army activity recruitment call was solicited with the application functional chief of the room submitted the request personal action online portal for the army acquisition activity recruitment call for the activity to initial the verb terms associated with the target outreach location pilot and the receiver of the request personal action. His recruitment call for the prepared vacancy and announcement come with established policy for the other sort of the targeted outreach and internal of the permanent promotion of the recruitment of the functional chief of the review. Request personal action online portal with the acquisition and recruitment call with the activity and internal vacancy with the desire to fill with the request of the personal action and activity recruitment call with the prepared vacancy and announcement. Additional policy, proceed with the guidance available to the active of the recruitment call for the website, selection with the functional chief of the review with the coordinates, and conduct self-selection process, input with the command support from the active as recruitment call the following process, referral list, acquisition, referral, recruitment call, the civil personal placement program, review transcript of appointment with the eligibility issue with the referral, the eligibility with the functional chief of the review, initiate with the request personal action. Actives recruitment call will clear with the DoD with a priority placement program, DoD reemployment priority list and crowd with the request and personal action for the initial in hiring with the activity intern program provided. Activity intern program is informal training. Program, and there's no other requirement again of the clear of the priority placement program re-employment, the priority list for the promotion placement of the specified full performance level, the activity and permanent position, selection panel of the performance functional chief of the review of the coordinator of the conduct of the activity and initial of the selection panel of the deliberation with the committee of the Department of Defense, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of Air, Civilian Personnel will notify of the deviation, centralized strategy, panel of the must include the committee of the representative of the functional subject matter of the expert for the functional representative of the coordinator of the command of the notify of the Army Reserve or active of the reserve recruitment call, Department of Defense, Secretary of Civilian Personal Defense, and the Civilian Career Proponent of the Division, each was selected for the selection of the Army recruitment call. Activity of the recruitment call with the job offer the EOD the day with the script of the documentation, EO of the D of the assistance of the manpower reserve of the affairs, approve of the plan, extend with the pressure for the acquisition. Activity of the recruitment call with the uniform of the applicants, civilian personnel with the functional chief of the reserve of the Department of Defense, Secretary of the Civil personnel will employ with the command of the act as intern permanent change station, where the initial employment of the activity intern program and in terms of employing operation of the report due to the activities intern submitted with the PCS orders to the DSA with the chief civilian personnel for funding. Department of Defense and Secretary of Affairs civilian personnel approve of the PCS order returned to the functional chief of the reserve representative of activities and term of the PCS. Permanent change of sedation order that must be was submitted by the Department of Defense, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of Air, Civilian Personnel at least 30 days before the activity with the EOD, entrance on duty of the permanent change of station over the last 30 days for the entrance on duty with the employee of the organization of the Department of Defense, Secretary of Civilian Personnel Acquisition Recruitment Call request extend to the end of the entry on duty outside of the employing organization activity in terms of the initial placement during the deployment of providing efficiency, effective on-job training, according to the applicable to the MIT Master Intern Training Plan, functional chief of the representative, and procedure that intern organization conducted during providing new interns accurately through the Army's career program, implemented intern with the onset with the functional chief of the review, maintaining cognitive intern pulled up population, monitoring the intern profit of the MITP with authorized training, development, research of the necessary facility, completion of MITP, maintain communication command with the Department of Defense, Secretary of Air, Civilian Personnel, identify assist for the reconciliation, personal performance training issues. Graduate placement with a considerable term of the mobility with agreement is signed with the end of the entry on due with the activity in term of the upon with a sufficient completion of the MITP in place with a permanent with a position with the team with the best fulfill with the priority mission need with the Army, the functional chief of the representative of the responsible for monitoring the activities in term of the progress of the MTIP with the coordinator of the time with the permanent placement with the action of the graduate with the goal with the functional chief of the review with the permanent play with each with the gravity activities with the approximate 90 with the prior with the graduation with the intern with the program permanent placement activities in terms of not identified with the following procedure of the design and ensure the permanent placement approximately 6-9 months prior to the anticipated completion of MIT with the functional chief of the review obtained with the current resume with each of the proposed perspective of the activities intern granted with civil personnel with the functional chief of the review of the team with the statement of activities in terms of the placement performance limitation and understanding preference considered for the will be not determinative of the functional chief of the review with commands of the notified with the Army acquisitions recruitment call with the Department of Defense, Secretary of Air, Civilian Personnel, and the Civilian Career Proponency Division, each selection with the functional chief of the review informed with command with the implementation graduation perspective the activities in term of the graduate resume available solicitor placement with the perspective in term graduate commands Man sinking fill of the vacant mid-level position should be encouraged to achieve the candidates for the activity intern program. Man submit bids, placement of the projected activity intern, graduate functional chief of the reserve for a statement and process to fill mid-level vacancy function, chief of the representative and coordinator of the committee with evaluated bids for the make of the final initial interim place the position, typically not later than 90 for the prior to the select completion of the MTIBD committee with the authorized announced fill mid-level the position series currently covered with the activity intern of the program and only after the coordinator of the functional chief of the representative of concurrence. Require the permanent placement and employment and game with the organization in terms of the initial due location, permanent change of station, Department of Defense Secretary of the Army Civilian Personnel Funding. One for the Department of Defense Secretary Civilian Personnel to approve the permanent change of the station order for the return in terms of employment with the Gaining Organization Act. That is. Permanent change of station. Orders must be submitted to the Department of Defense Secretary of the Civilian Personnel at least 30 days effective of the day of the activity in terms of the permanent placement in order to ensure the timely funding. Functional chief of the review with the unable to identify the appropriate placement and unable in terms of the graduation. Functional chief of the review request acquisition. Department of Defense Secretary of Civilian Personnel. The Department of Defense Secretary of Civilian Personnel account with the Civilian and Human Resource with a free vacancy, like series of the grades of the placement of the graduating activity in the placement position confirmed with the Civilian and Human Resource notified by the Department of Defense Secretary, Civilian Personnel Coordinated Selection Decision, Functional Civilian Resource for the Gaining and Loss for the Command of the Department of Defense Secretary, Civilian Personnel Coordinated with the Function, Civilian, Functional Civilian Review, Functional Chief Representative of the Community Civilian Human Resource Agency with the direct and placement surplus activity in terms of the Army-wide vacancy. If no position identified with the result of the freeing vacant, the Department of Defense Secretary of Affairs, Civilian Personnel may grant with a continuing activity and determine the centralized activity initial with account with 120 days beyond the initial of the 2 year within order to afford with a limited additional time with the placement of the graduation, term of the activity and the term of the Army employment and term placement activity and term of the graduated Army position should be not subject to the ongoing hiring freeze of the hiring restriction activity initial with the does not add to order civilian strength of the Army. The approve of the graduate placement profit accomplished in the accordance with the term and applicable to the collective bargaining agreement and statutory labor regulation obligation 612. Post-graduation functional chief of the representative of the manager of the continuum of the program and program of the development of the graduate and functional chief of the representative will maintain with the longitude of the demographical date with the example of promotion, the educational staff with the retention rates in order to determine the effectiveness of the master intern training plan and how the program is translated with the other leadership of the development of the senior enterprise talent management of the appropriate section 3. Army Intern Program Management. The Army Intern Vacancy Announcement Selection of the Army Intern Position announced for the entry level, the recommended highest entry level grade activity in terms of the GS-07 Program Presidential Management Fellow with GS-9. Normal target grade activity in turn is in GS-11 target grade GS-11 that must obtain the prior with the Department of Defense Secretary of the Civil Personnel and Civilian Career Programs of the Division. Functional Chief of the Review of the Program Presidential Manual Fellow with the target with the GS-12 with the Army Acquisition Recruitment Call authority with the activity interim vacancy announcement selection requirements. Master in training plan with the interim of the individual development on 30 day with the entire entry of the duty with the baseline with the individual development plan, master intern training plan, master intern training plan, part of the activity plan provided with the Army intent with the detailed training plan with the consider the on-travel development and assignment with the technical training with the necessary with the training, prepare an intern with the target grade level. The supervisor should custom with the plan both of the needs of the career program organization individual plan with different based of the one organizational function of the project placement and the placement of the supervisor of the individual plan with the after consultation of the civilian career program management and the activity career program manager is applicable. The performance recognition in terms of the recognize with the performance rating in accordance with the Army Regulation 694 on charge Chapter 430 with equivalent talent rating. The equivalent rating system on the refer should be established performing the objective to align with the on-job development assignment, technical training accomplished with the master intern of the training plan with an individual development in terms of the must recognize the monetary and non-monetary award according to the Army Regulation 670-20 with the Army activity funding with will not be with the monetary awards. 616, inability to meet the performance requirements of the supervisor responsible for the address of the initial ability to meet performance requirements, need for the problem with the poor job performance, prepared to complete training with the act of the misconduct of the delinquency, determine the supervisor of the course over the area of the consultative servicing of the civilian person advisory council for the system of addressing performance issues. Promotion requirement that completes for the 52-week time period with a grade with a requirement that must be a shovel of internally eligible to promotion. Next higher grade with a completion within the time of the grade with the requirement it does not entail with the interim of the promotion with the next grade level addition with the time of the grade requirement determination made with the supervisor or interim that has successfully performed on the current grade level that has the ability to perform on the next higher level grade level to supervise the promotion of the okay, with the tape. Request for personal action servicing with a CPA, see with the least with the advanced additional promotion. Essential Army the internship with the active with the internship with the extend with the additional with the 120 days beyond the initial 2 years cover the unusual circumstance with the addition situation with the request for the active with the internship with the extension with the submitted with the respect with the functional chief of the representative to the Department of Defense of the Assistant Secretary Army Civilian Personnel, the career civilian personnel proponents of the division with not less than 90 days before the normal promotion graduation of the Department of Defense Secretary of the Army Civilian Personnel with the final approval of the authority. Overtime funding the activities funding with may only be used to fund overtime the head of the interim of the traveling and two on the front of the train with the committee of the local fund with the must be used to fund the other types of overtime rule of travel hours worth depending on the web of the employees covered except for the Fair Labor Standard Act of the context everything of the civilian personnel. So the CPA, see with additional with the Fair Labor Standard Act and the information 620 permanent change of station activities from the limited to the permanent change of the move with the interim and after the beginning of the end of the 2 year with the funding and limitation of the rules is not with graduation activity in terms of the requirement placement assistant also with the training with the command of the functional chief of the review selecting official advice in terms of the personal change of the station and entitlement accordingly. Section 621 of the Army Civilian Training Education Development System and in terms of outside of the Continental United States Act tears and with not promoted the placement outside of the Continental United States however the responsible command of the functional chief of the reserve of the CPPO staff with the ultimate with the acquisition and recruitment call of the most clearly develop the personnel O'Connell's and employment identification O'Connell's duty location additional information available to the acquisition recruitment call interim reduction and force guidance of the activity of the interim of the play with the separate of the community complete area with the reduction and force purpose of the conduct serving the CPAs with additional foreign fellows information. Section 4 Army Presidential Management Fellows Program. And we'll cut the tape there and we'll read the last section.